Episode 9 of Band of Brothers is considered the highest rated episode of them all, and after going back in for a rewatch of it, it's clear to see why it can be perceived as that. It's one of the most emotional episodes in the entirety of the series, and despite there being no direct conflict or battle scenes, this episode highlighted the effects of the Second World War in a different way, and it really focused on getting across the message of the title of the episode, Why We Fight. With an ending that also landed with such impact, let's jump into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is a breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 9. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The interviews. Like with every episode of the show, this one started off with interviews from the real-life veterans that were part of the 101st Airborne Division. Within the episode, the veterans that were being interviewed were Norman Nietzsche, Lester Hashi, Joe Lesnilsky, Earl McClung, and Shifty Powers. What was particularly interesting about this set of interviews was that it had a slightly more positive outlook on the future. It was mentioned that there was a general mood of the war coming to an end, and that people were happy to see that the change in tide was coming. It was also said how the Germans had lost their heart to fight. However, the one thing that stood out to me was that they mentioned how they were starting to see the German troops more like humans and not these evil beings. People that were just being told to do something, just as they were, but just on two different sides. With Shifty Powers saying how in another situation, two men on either side could have been friends, how they may have wanted to have fished together and things like that, it did show that on both sides of the war, the men that were fighting were human and were just following orders. This was a complete change in mindset to how we'd seen the real-life people being depicted in the show up until that point when thinking of German troops before. This change in mindset was something that wasn't necessarily depicted in the episode. Usually the interviews are quite well connected to the episode, but with the way that Webster and many others acted in the episode, it didn't lean into the they were just humans approach. However, one way that it did connect to the story was with the way that the war was coming to an end and the mindset that many of the troops had, as we saw that being present throughout many of the men in this episode. The interviews in Band of Brothers provide such clarity and give great insight, something that was missing with Masters of the Air. I'm just happy that this show was made at a time when many of these great men were still alive and had the opportunity to have their input and share the experiences that they had. April the 11th, 1945, Thalheim, Germany. In terms of the structuring of an episode of Band of Brothers, this one was done slightly differently to how we've seen it done before. If anything, it kind of bore a similar resemblance to the first episode of the show. This episode began where it ended, and it was at a different period of time. Within the opening section, we saw that it was April the 11th in Thalheim, Germany, and the citizens there were looking amongst the ruins of the town and were making a start to clearing up the mess that was there. Beethoven was being played over this scene, and it was at this moment where Nixon corrected the men who believed that they were listening to Mozart. There are a few different things to take away from this scene and the correction that Nixon gave in this moment, and I think it's up for interpretation. The piece that was being played is titled String Quartet No. 14 in C-sharp minor, and it's often considered one of Beethoven's most beautiful pieces. The contrast of having the beauty amongst the chaos and devastation that underpinned this episode is something that can't be ignored. Nixon's correction was something that also showed that even amongst the chaos that we saw him undergo with the spiraling of his family life back home whilst he was out in a foreign land, that was something which drew him in and allowed him to appreciate what wasn't beauty in the mind or on the eyes, but in the ears. I would also say as well, Beethoven was German and Mozart was Austrian. Germany birthed Beethoven, somebody who created such beauty and graced the world with his compositions. But at the time the show was set in, Germany was causing such terror around the world, something which again was a contrast to what it was that we were hearing. So this scene, despite being small, it had many different takeaways from it. From there, the episode then went back in time by 1 month to Struzelberg, Germany. We started by seeing Luz and Paconti in a farmer's house taking eggs from the chicken. At this time as well, we also saw Janowek being intimate with a woman, and we also saw Spears collecting ornaments and shipping them back home. This was something which was in complete contrast to any of the episodes before. The men were well looked after, had a positive mind, food in their belly, and were around women. At least, Luz was trying to be, but got a slap in the face. This really did show us how different things were, and that the tides were changing. The positive mindset was something that was infectious, but it no longer evoked the fear of dying so close to the end like it did in episode 8, but rather it seemed to be getting embraced. This was made most apparent when Spears was speaking with the private who was going to ship the items back home, and he said how he'd have a good collection when he got back home, and that was met with a smile. Before, that would have been something that none of the men would have dared to have said. Amongst the positivity and happiness, we saw this episode through the eyes of Nixon, somebody whose life was spiraling out of control back home and there was just nothing he could do about it. He was also mourning the death of many of the men who were killed by a direct hit when he was on a jump. Nixon couldn't face writing the letters to the boys' families back home and saying that they died heroes. This was leading him to question the very reason as to why they were all out there and if it was all worth it, mainly because of the sheer amount of death that he'd seen. But I also feel as though he was feeling like there was a sense of lack of contribution on his part. He mentioned how he'd never fired a weapon whilst in combat, even amongst all of the action. So I think that was something that was also within his mind. The fact that Nixon said, "You still believe that," to Winters when he mentioned that he had to write that the boys died heroes, it showed that his mindset was definitely different to the many men that he was around at that point, and he was questioning his very purpose. The real-life Nixon did partake in the jump that was referenced when crossing over the River Rhine, and the plane did take a direct hit. It was only himself and 3 others that managed to get out of there. When Winters mentioned about Nixon having 3 combat jump stars on his jump wings, that was also correct too. He's one of only very few men that achieved that. Whilst this scene was going on, Nix was pouring himself a glass of VAT 69. Nixon was portrayed as a drinker all throughout the series, but in this episode in particular, he was turning to the bottle quite frequently. It felt like it was his escapism and his way of getting out of his own mind and not thinking about everything that was going on within it. Whether that be the death of the men that he served alongside, or his wife Kathy wanting to divorce him. The real-life Lewis Nixon was said to always have a source of whiskey no matter where the company was, and that whiskey was more often than not VAT 69, hence why it had a large inclusion in this episode. Nixon was also demoted in this part of the episode as well. When doing some research on the real Nixon, it was said that he developed a drinking problem and was eventually removed and assigned back down to the 2nd Battalion as the operations officer. This meant that he didn't need to deal with the politics and high visibility at the regimental level, but he was still able to showcase his skills at planning and operations. The next part of the episode was focused around O'Keefe and Paconti, and what was interesting about this section was that it still showed that the mindset towards the replacements was just as prominent at the back end of the war as it was when they got their first batch of replacements in. Paconti saw O'Keefe as a replacement, and there was friction between them. O'Keefe was etching to see some action, something that Paconti took offense to. Paconti hadn't been home in 2 years, had seen a lot of the original Toccoa boys get killed or leave the war, and for the first time in a long while, he had a full belly and was sleeping on a bed. So it was the best situation that he'd been in, far different to the likes of Bastogne, a period of time that was one of the toughest, and all O'Keefe was talking about was seeing action. So it made sense as to why Paconti reacted in the way that he did. At this point, Nixon was searching for VAT 69. However, he couldn't find any, but the lack of whiskey was getting to him. So much so that he asked the private who was in charge of the mail to keep an eye out for some and to let him know if any came in. With Nixon destroying a shop window, walking out of a game of cards with his money on the line, and also leaving his mail on the side and forgetting it, it showed that there was quite literally nothing at that moment in time that was more important to him than having a drink. Not the message from home, nor the money in his pocket, so it really did show the state of mind that he was in. It was at this point as well where there were 2 large news announcements. The first was that 300,000 German soldiers had surrendered, and also that Nixon's wife back home, Kathy, was divorcing him and taking everything, even the dog. Nixon's story was spiraling downwards at this point, and we saw that he was on the cusp of becoming a completely broken man. With the men then heading towards the Alps, all of the men were singing Blood on the Risers. This was an American paratrooper song from the Second World War, and the song is now associated with all current American airborne units. The togetherness of the men and the almost happiness was something that we hadn't seen up until this point in the show. There was optimism, hope, and there was an encounter with Webster and Liebgott where they were getting to know each other more, which almost showed that there wasn't a fear of getting to know somebody and then losing them, which made the mourning more difficult. So there was a positivity in the air, just like what was mentioned in the opening interviews. With Webster mentioning that he studied literature, within real life, following him being considered lost at sea in 1961, over 30 years later in 1994, Webster's diary entries from his time at war were published. It was said that his trained eye, honesty, and writing skills helped give the book and the miniseries Band of Brothers a colour and tone that wasn't available in other diaries. During the journey, there was a scene where the soldiers that had surrendered were marching back, and Webster had an outburst where he himself was also questioning why it was that they were fighting, annoyed at the fact that they'd been dragged halfway around the world, shouting, "What are we doing here?" Something again that tied back to the title of the episode, showing that although there was positivity amongst the men, there was that feeling of not truly knowing what they were doing. It was after this moment that the tone of the episode changed, and what is the second half then began. What was originally about the men questioning why they were there and feeling like they were burned out, turned into them being hit directly in the face with the reality of why they were there, and making them see that their contributions were paramount and vital. With a patrol taking place in the nearby forest, several men stumbled across a concentration camp. There was a moment where it was said that it was awfully quiet, and shortly after that, they were met with the horrific sight. Before that happened though, we saw Nixon in a house where he was continuing his search for the whiskey, and he stumbled across a photo of a German officer which he smashed on the floor, but he was interrupted by his wife entering the room. There was a moment where as Nixon was leaving, their dog was barking at him, something which warranted a disgruntled look on Nixon's face, most likely because it reminded him of the dog that he was going to lose in the divorce that was going to be taking place. With Paconti notifying Winters of what was found in the woods, many of the men drove to the location. The camp that was found was Kaufering 4. This concentration camp was created in September of 1944 with the intention of holding 500 prisoners. However, it went on to have around 3,000 prisoners. As time went on, the camp eventually converted into a sick camp where people were sent to die after they could no longer work. The camp was in fact liberated by the American Army in April 1945, as was depicted in the show. A few days before the liberation, hundreds of sick and wounded prisoners were killed by the guards before they fled. This meant that only several hundred people survived from the camp when it was estimated that there were 3,000 people in there at one point. The scenes that took place in the show were some of the most striking, horrific, and haunting from not only this show, but from any depiction that has tackled this before. The emotion that it evoked was something which truly got across the evil nature that was present, and it honestly made you question how there could be people out there that could do this to other human beings. The sheer amount of dead that was present, but also the conditions that they were in, and the fact that they were on the verge of death made it difficult to keep looking at the screen. The shot where they opened up the cart doors, it was just utterly horrific and showed that there was no escaping death from within or outside of the gates. Hearing how the guards started killing the prisoners and then only when they ran out of ammo was when they stopped, it was something which was just simply awful to hear, and the reaction on everybody's faces spoke 1,000 words without need for dialogue. Seeing the prisoners holding onto the troops, grabbing their uniform, crying into their arms and embracing them, it showed the pain that they'd suffered through and the appreciation that they had to finally be saved. When Liebgott was speaking with one of the prisoners, he mentioned that the women's camp was at the next railroad stop, and it was a haunting reminder that this wasn't the only one. There were more, and there were some which were larger too, as we later went on to hear when Winters said how one which was 10 times larger was liberated. I'm presuming that it was Auschwitz-Birkenau that he was referring to. One of the hardest hitting moments in this episode came when Liebgott had to tell the prisoners that they had to get back inside of the gates of the camp so that they could be monitored when it came to their food intake, as it was dangerous for them to eat as much as they liked because they were so malnourished. Liebgott was perceived to be a Jewish man by the men in the company, hence why he was in the book and in the miniseries. This is something which added to the powerful nature of the scene. However, since the book and TV series was released, it's actually been said that Liebgott was raised Roman Catholic, and the Austrian German that he spoke was mistakenly interpreted to be Yiddish by other people. Whilst his family name, Zimmerman, is often a Jewish name, it's said that maybe one of his parents was born Jewish, but he was raised Roman Catholic. Even though he may not have been Jewish, it doesn't take away from the powerful nature of the scene. The prisoners finally having freedom, but then being told to go back to the place where they'd experienced what could only be described as an unimaginable hell, was simply awful. The faces of the men, one which expressed fear, showed just how fearful they were going back inside. Plus, with Liebgott breaking down, it made it even more heartbreaking. With General Taylor declaring martial law in the town, he ordered all of the men and women to go to the camp to help bury the dead. This was something which showed the civilians of the town what had been going on just through the other side of the forest. Many of the civilians claimed that they didn't know what was going on, but like Webster said, how could they not? During this scene as well, the woman who was in the house that Nixon broke into was there. She was the wife of a German officer that was well respected, which meant that she would have most definitely known what was going on. So the fact that she was standing there, contributing to burying the dead and sharing a look with Nixon, it just made me think that there were other people that 100% knew. Within real life, the troops did actually have to send the prisoners back into the camp because there wasn't enough medical care available, and the civilians were forced to bury the dead too. This whole second part of the episode truly served in showing us why it was that these men were fighting the war. It was tonally different to the first part, and it arrived for the men when they needed it, showing that their contributions were saving lives and that it contributed to ridding the world of the evil regime. I feel it also put Nixon's problems into perspective for him. Granted, what he was going through back home with his wife leaving him was awful, but what we saw, I think it made him realize that it didn't mean the end for him. The real-life Nixon did actually get divorced by Kathy, and his second marriage also failed. However, in 1956, Nixon married for the third and final time, somebody called Grace. Richard Winters was the best man at Nixon's wedding as well, and it's said that Nixon overcame alcoholism during their marriage. Nixon died at the age of 76 in 1995 due to complications from diabetes. Winters gave the eulogy at Nixon's funeral at the request of Grace, something which did show just how close Winters and Nixon were. They served together, worked together after the war. Winters was his best man, and he also gave the eulogy at his funeral. My review of the episode. I personally think that this is one of the best episodes in the series for sure. I thought by not having a single shot fired, something which connected to Nixon and the fact that he never fired a shot in combat was a really nice touch. I don't know if it was deliberate, but if it wasn't, then it was a great coincidence. Leaning in on the boys' mindset of questioning what they were doing there and what it was that they were fighting for was something that I thought was an interesting approach. You don't often think of that, but I imagine after many of the men had lost friends, were missing their family, and also probably just wanted to be home, many of them would have had that question going through their mind. The first half of this episode was relatively light in terms of tone. The men were almost just doing as they pleased, looting, drinking, searching for booze, and going from one place to the next. But that second part, it didn't want to hide the evil from us, and it didn't hold back in showing us the terrors that many people went through. As it said at the end, 5 million ethnic minorities and 6 million Jewish people were murdered. I thought Ron Livingston did a great job in this episode as Nixon. You really felt the world on his shoulders and all of the problems that he had going on in his mind. You also felt his reliance on drink and that it was the very thing that he needed to get him through the day. Sometimes a lack of combat can be an issue when it comes to watching depictions of war, but in this instance, I don't think that was the case at all. The dialogue was crafted in such an artistic way that it allowed us to truly understand what the boys were saying and everything that they were going through. The positive start and the tragedy at the end took us on a complete journey, and it's the episode in the series that definitely sticks with you the most after completing the show because of the striking visuals. We've only got one more episode to go until I finish covering Band of Brothers. The show does have a great finale, and it's an episode that again is quite different to all of the others, and it's also one of the highest rated ones out of the 10. So be sure to come back for the breakdown on the finale. So, there you have it, a breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 9. If you want to see a breakdown of every episode of Band of Brothers, then click on the card in the top corner. I've been covering every episode, so if you want to see more, then there's an entire playlist on the channel. What do you think of episode 9? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.